Naturalist-David-Mizejewski is back on Big Blend Radio's Garden Gossip Show today, not only to talk about gardening to attract birds, butterflies, and wildlife into your garden, but to share tips on getting kids out into the garden, too, and enjoying nature. David is the author of the award-winning how-to book. It's called Attracting Birds, Butterflies, and Other Backyard Wildlife. He is also a naturalist with the National Wildlife Federation and an expert spokesperson for their amazing program, the National Wildlife Federation's Garden for Wildlife program. Since 1973, this has been going on, and they have been educating and empowering people to turn their garden spaces into thriving habitats for birds, butterflies, and other wildlife. And one of the things we've learned with David over the last few months and years, actually, is that once you change your principles of growing this way and doing more native plants, all of a sudden your gardens will thrive. And he taught me the last time on the show, it's like what we're doing in our gardens, we can just step by step start replacing some plants or adding plants. You don't have to tear everything out. Just simple things that we do not become a dead zone of a community. And I think this is so exciting, and I think it's exciting to get kids out there. I encourage you to go to the website. It's nwf.org/garden. Hey, David, welcome back. How are you?
Hi there. I'm doing really well.
Hey, we're excited to have you on the show because, listen, you're talking about getting kids in the garden, and I have been on the website, nwf.org, everyone. There's a whole section for getting kids out into the garden for wildlife. And I want to be a kid. I want to make fairy houses. There's all these projects. There's projects on learning about daddy long legs and bullfrogs. I mean, there's all these cool things that can I be a kid? Am I allowed?
Everybody can be a kid.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
I mean, that's one of the fun things about getting outdoors, and whether you're gardening or not. I think being outside gives us permission to kind of reconnect with our own, our own youth and our own, our inner child, right? I mean, most of us hopefully had the opportunity to play outside at least some of the time as kids, and I love that. I'm going to be thinking about that the next time I go out in my yard and putting my hands in my little pond to pull stuff out and look for snails and whatever, to kind of take a second and enjoy it the same way that I did as a kid.
Yeah, it's huge. To me, growing up, I was always out in the garden, and now, I'll do anything to be outside and not inside next to a computer. I start to realize I get crabby, and I'm not the nicest person when I'm not out there with that. And
I'm
looking
not
at
saying
bugs.
anything.
No, I know. Well, let me just talk about you. Anyway, no. But there's something that I think this is invaluable. We were just talking with our guest prior to you, and she was talking about our community gardens and getting school gardens going, and that was one of the things I also learned on the website today with nwf.org/garden, school gardens. And this is another thing. There's personal gardens, but then school gardens also being a big deal. And going through that, I realized how much this is important for kids' development, educationally. This isn't just about, oh, cool, I want to make a fairy garden. This is I really do. I did have one. But this is about, they're actually learning math and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm really glad you brought all of that up. I mean, two of the big pillars of the National Wildlife Federation over our 80-plus year history are things that you might not necessarily think go hand in hand with a wildlife conservation organization. Yes, we do work on on endangered species and protecting habitats and all the stuff that you would expect of a wildlife group. But we, as you mentioned, since 1973 have been really active in this space of wildlife habitat gardening, planting stuff in our backyards, in our neighborhoods, in our communities, in our cities, in our towns that kind of make them a little bit more habitable to other species and kind of invite those wildlife that otherwise get banished out of our cities into the ever-shrinking wilderness, back in so they can share the space with us. And so this whole idea of urban ecology is something that the National Wildlife Federation has been doing for decades. In fact, we're celebrating the 45th anniversary of the program this year. The other thing is this idea of connecting kids to nature. And it's one of the things that we do at the National Wildlife Federation that most of our fellow conservation organizations don't really focus on. There's a lot of, kid-focused groups out there, and there are local groups that kind of get involved here. But at the national level, we're one of the only ones that really focus on this. And, it goes all the way back to, 51 years ago with the beginning of the publishing of Ranger Rick magazine, which is going
strong.
yeah.
Mm-hmm. You know, I love
and
that
so
magazine.
it's part of our sort of our core organizational identity. This idea of we not only need to protect wildlife now, but we need to make sure that we're connecting the next generation to the natural world and exposing them to how awesome wildlife are, so that when they grow up into adults, they actually know a little bit about it and they care about it. And that's actually backed up by research, by the way. There's research that shows that kids that have the opportunity to go outside and see and have personal experiences in nature, especially if they have an adult mentor that helps them do that, they generally grow up into adults that have higher science literacy and they on a values level they care about protecting wildlife and nature. And so both of those things are really essential to just the identity of who the National Wildlife Federation is. And so whether it's, we're still publishing Ranger Rick magazine, we actually got 3 different editions for different age groups. So from the little toddlers all the way up to, preteens can be reading various Ranger Rick titles. We've got the companion website, which you've mentioned, with all sorts of, fun stuff on there, comics and games and activities and that kind of thing. You mentioned our schoolyard habitats program. And that is really, really a neat program. It started back in the 90s, and it's now part of our bigger Eco Schools USA program, which is all about greening schools from top to bottom. It's actually an international program that the National Wildlife Federation implements here in the USA. But the schoolyard habitats piece grew out of our wildlife gardening program. And the idea, as you were mentioning, is not just that you're going to create a wildlife habitat garden that's going to attract the birds and the butterflies and provide habitat, but that it's actually going to be used as an outdoor classroom. And I'm so glad you mentioned math, because a lot of people think, oh yeah, like we could teach science class out there. You can teach anything outside in a wildlife garden. And different kids have different learning styles. And not every kid, is going to benefit from being cooped up in a classroom all day. And so when schools are able to incorporate some outdoor learning, it actually can really benefit. There's a whole host of benefits. I could go on and on and on.
Well, I think this is so cool because just as I look at my upbringing, and luckily, I did no different than being urban. I was out in the bush for many years in Africa and Kenya as a kid, and then did go into the urban setting and had to change my perspective. And Ranger Rick was with me throughout, even while we were in Kenya. We were getting them, and I had these huge. Do you remember? Okay, like David, I don't think we're that far apart in age. Do you remember the big binders of projects we would get? There's a magazine.
Oh yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now I know we are all digital, right? But I remember those big binders, and I was like, where's my next Ranger Rick? Who cares about the next toy? I want that. There was these projects, but you'd go out, and it was so interesting.
So cool.
Later in life, going to high school and having to do biology class, all of that came back to me, and it was like this became things that I understood, and I understood biology. When the teacher was talking about things, I understood what a spore was. I understood how pine cones worked compared to over here what a bulb was. Or I understood things. I was like ahead of my class from that magazine and those projects. And because then I became a geek into it. Like it was like, this is it. Every bug, every snake, every lizard. Like, dude,
that's how it works,
cool. Look
you
at
know.
Can I just say, as a parent, it made my job so much easier.
I know, but it's so exciting, and there's projects, and it's like the Junior Ranger program in national parks. I know adults that are now going around and they're retired, and they're doing all the Junior Ranger programs. So do you see, like, adults getting involved in this, like, on their own, like, excitement side because it's cool and fun?
Oh yeah, I mean the idea that the National Wildlife Federation and all these great programs and resources and Ranger Rick magazine are there to help parents is by design. We know that a lot of people don't feel like they're nature experts, or they might not even be comfortable going outside, let alone taking their kids out and letting them run kind of and explore, or even going camping or something like that. And so we try to make it as easy as possible and be that like trusted resource that with again decades of experience. I mean, I have to say my colleagues who work on Ranger Rick magazine and in our educator programs and our school programs are just like some of the top-notch people in those fields. I mean, Ranger Rick Magazine wins awards every year, and I can brag about that because I'm not personally involved in making those magazines, but I'm really proud of that on behalf of the National Wildlife Federation. So yeah, I mean, we've got experts that know how to talk to kids in a fun, entertaining, but also educational way about all sorts of things that are sciencey or even environmental issues in ways that are age appropriate and ways that help them understand some of maybe again the complex science and so on and so forth. So yeah, I mean, I'm really glad that you picked up on that fact that we're a resource for parents too, or anybody that has a kid in their life.
Yeah, because especially if you're living in a city and maybe you weren't raised as a parent, you could be a new parent and you weren't raised that way. And maybe you have no clue. You lived in, downtown Brooklyn, which I don't know downtown Brooklyn, but I know you do better than me. You're on that side of the hood of the state or the country, I should say. But there's a lot of people that were not raised understanding nature. In fact, there's a birder that we know who was on our shows for many years, and he's now retired. And he was raised out in Southern California. And they lived out in the boonies, and they lived in tents as kids. And they, as bird watchers, they learned the birds. Him and his brother lived in a tent. I mean, this is. I don't know if this was all legal, but this is how they lived. And they made up their own bird names.
Yeah.
According to the bird's voice, how they acted. And this was back in the 30s that they were doing this. And they learned animals this way. And then all of a sudden they ended up going from Southern California on the border, living in the border, like Campo area of San Diego, living up in downtown L.A. kind of deal, East L.A., not downtown, East L.A. And suddenly that was gone, but then they saw, wait, some of the birds were still there. And they didn't know that Sibley's was around or Ranger Rick at this point because they had been kind of shut out that way because of what their parents were doing, living-wise. And his dad was working on the water systems and piping out in that area. So it wasn't a negative thing. But this is what they did. They created their own bird names. But they watched, and as kids, this was their whole thing. And so I think this is so important that parents do have these resources because sometimes parents didn't get a chance to bird watch or have a garden. They didn't get that opportunity. And now with community gardens and school gardens and church gardens and, come on, apartment complexes, get with that too.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
We can change this mold, and through the kids, the parents will learn.
100%. And if anybody out there listening has kids, you know that that's how it works, right? Your kids get obsessed with something, and the next thing you know, you're an expert at it. But yeah, no, that's such a great story because you're absolutely right. A lot of people maybe didn't grow up with that kind of exposure to nature, but that's the beauty of a wildlife garden. Because if you plant some native plants and that are going to attract butterflies, and if you leave some shrubs up where the birds can nest, and maybe you put out a bird bath, minimize the size of your lawn a little bit, give over a little bit of that space to some natural plants, the next thing you know, you're going to have this really cool wildlife oasis that is beautiful. You're going to feel good about it because you're helping out the local wildlife. But what better place and what safer place to let your kids go explore nature than literally right outside your own door?
Exactly.
Like you don't have to be a naturalist like me, and you don't have to be a wilderness guide to give your kids these kinds of outdoor experiences where they're getting to observe really neat animals. And, we're not talking, lions and tigers and bears. We're talking, tiger beetles and antlions and, some other smaller critter that's named after a bear. Birds and butterflies and insects and frogs, the kinds of animals that can live in your yard. And, again, you don't have to go off into the wilderness to do that. You don't have to be an expert. But if you let your kids go outside, which is sadly something that is happening less and less and less nowadays for a host of reasons, but this idea of creating a wildlife garden can be a really great solution to, again, parents' feelings like they can't do this on their own, but also helping parents get over some of those fears that we have today that, we're afraid to let our kids, play in the neighborhood for whatever reason. But again, if you do this in your own yard, not only will it be interesting for the kids, there'll be tons for them to kind of explore and do and learn. And if you need help, again, if you go to our website, we've got tons of outdoor activities and stuff like that, crafts that you can engage the kids with, but while still letting them kind of play and explore on their own. It's the perfect solution.
I find it interesting because there's a being taught syndrome, and then there's a go outside, have some fun, and explore, and come back with questions.
Yes.
And I think that's where parents get a little jittery because they can't always answer the questions. 9 times out of 10 they can't answer it. But now we can go Google and try to find an answer.
They have everything on the website, yeah.
But when I was bringing Lisa up and she was going outside and exploring, and she would come back in with, hey, what's this, what's that? And then she brings it in with her. I'm like, uh-oh. No, it's okay. There's the education I had to have to, say what it was. But I learned early on to say, I don't know, let's go find out, instead of trying to pretend I knew.
It became a family project.
And it was so cool because then
you guys are so intuitive with all of this, and you're hitting everything that I wanted to make sure I got to tonight talking to you guys. And that is, what you're touching on is the value of unscheduled outdoor playtime. And, play has this sort of negative connotation sometimes, like it's frivolous, and but play is how animals in the natural world learn, and how they how they get the skills that they need, and they hone the skills they need to survive. It's the same thing with humans. When we go outside and we play, and explore, it helps us learn about the natural world around us, which gives us really valuable information. And the fact is that kids today, one of the problems is that they're actually overscheduled. They get up in the morning, they go to school, they go to their after-school activities, they do their after-school sports or whatever, then they come home and they play on their iPad for an hour, and then they go to bed. And then on the weekends, they're being shuttled from soccer game to this birthday party. It's all structured activities. And what is lacking a little bit is what used to happen, in the olden days, where kids just had to go out and invent their own games and turn over rocks and look for frogs and things like that. And so that kind of unscheduled, unstructured playtime is what not only is missing, but it's particularly valuable because it engages kids mentally and physically, and kind of piques their curiosity about the world in a way that a very structured activity doesn't. Now, again, don't get me wrong. There's nothing wrong with any of those other things that I just listed. We do need classroom time, and we do need organized sports, and after-school activities are a godsend, I'm sure, for many parents. But we need to get a little bit more of that outdoor playtime, unstructured playtime, back into our kids' lives, because it's really important. And again, I could go on and do a whole show on some of the stats on the benefits of this outdoor play. Kids that get to go outside and do unstructured play, they tend to be more physically fit. If they have attention deficit issues, they oftentimes cope better in the classroom if they get that chance to get outside. They're less likely to be nearsighted. They're less likely to have vitamin D deficiency. There's just a whole list of things like that. So it's better for your kids.
David.
No, but there is something I want to call it the natural question, where okay, if you're in a classroom, the teacher says this, and then you may have a question, but it comes from because the teacher did this. When you're outside and you see something, as a adult or a child, you have what I would call, for want of a better phrase, the natural question, because it wasn't prompted by somebody telling you something.
That's what makes it
magic. It's prompted by seeing something.
Discovery.
And it's called natural curiosity for me.
Yep.
And then you come in and you want to know about it. Okay, now we have the internet and tools to look it up, which is great. Awesome. But the fact of the matter is you're more interested in a natural question for yourself if you want to know something than when it comes in another fashion.
This is from you. So now you become a human being.
Yeah. Lisa would go out in the garden, and we have weird gardens because we lived in Africa, but there's weird gardens here too, and she'd be like, this is not the same ant that was on that plant over there. This one's really big. And then why is this ant here doing the same thing as that ant or not? And we built her like a little hut thingy out of plywood.
A restaurant.
A restaurant.
A fake restaurant.
She said she wanted to be a waitress when she grew up. And I'm like, okay, let me show you what that's like. And so we built her a little hut thingy, and the termites ate it. And every day she'd come in and say, the restaurant's sinking. I'm like, that's right, those are termites.
I was a good waitress later.
And she'd go to the termites and say, what's your order? You know, it was really fun, to watch this whole thing of her watching, and she now gets how the world works.
That's the thing. It's a natural discovery. I think Nancy's right. And this thing
she
about
discovered herself.
Kids are able to go, I have a question, and it's beyond the curriculum. And this means that kids are thinking for themselves and starting to ask for themselves versus what's fed to them.
Exactly. And that's exactly it. I mean, when kids get to go out and explore on their own, their brains work, they have to. And even if they're not just like exploring nature, I mean, I'm even talking about just going out and, inventing games with their friends, and having the freedom to do that. And again, I know sometimes that's a luxury, not everybody has the same ability to do that with their kids, depending on where you live and what your resources are and that kind of thing. But, there's if you try, if you understand the importance of it, there's usually a way, whether, it's at a local park or, again, it could even be part of a club, I mean, there are Boy Scouts and Girl Scout groups and other groups like that even in the middle of cities or out in rural areas, where you might not have as many resources or whatever, or other kids to play with, that those structured things could be a vehicle for the unstructured play too. So, but yeah, that's how it works. And that's, again, one of the big things that the National Wildlife Federation is trying to get the word out about. And again, for us, it goes back to, we know that when kids go outside and play and explore, they learn about nature. And what's that saying? You only protect what you love, and you only love what you know. And if we're not ever giving kids today a chance to get to know nature and the wildlife that inhabits it, then what's going to happen when they grow up? Are they not going to know it, and then therefore they're not going to love it, and then therefore they're not going to protect it? So that's why we have such a heavy stake in this. We want to raise the next generation of conservationists.
And I think it's so important, number one, too, that because of the whole idea of the certified wildlife habitats and gardening for wildlife means that you're gardening for your kids too. And so I want to get into what we can do and how we can get kids in the garden, some projects, and what parents can do. And then we have to do a whole show on a segment just on the schools, because I think this is so crucial. But before we get there, I would say the first step from everything I've learned from you and going on the website, and I just wish we were all sitting outside with wine in the garden right now with the hummingbirds flying. Their hummingbirds are right here looking at us. But the thing, number one, is if you are growing a garden for wildlife and birds and butterflies and bees, you're growing a green, clean garden that kids can be in without risk of being sick from chemicals. I have two things on this. One is around the corner from us, there's a school, and they have this tiny corner.
I love it.
This is the weirdest thing. This tiny corner of a native garden that they've actively built. And we watched them do it years ago. And they have built this little tiny corner of a native garden, and they have signs up, and I think we've mentioned this on the show with you before. But it dawned on me the other morning, we took a sunrise walk through there, and I've noticed, like I said, I want to go there because the vermilion flycatchers, flycatchers are here in Arizona now. This is a season when they're here. I want to go see if the flycatchers are there. What I noticed is that the hawk is always, the Cooper's hawks hang out there, and the big ones do, that all of the bird life is congregating around this tiny corner of this school.
Yeah.
And the starlings were there, the flickers and the Gila woodpecker. I mean, they were all there, and I was like, this is crazy. As soon as you have this little vegetation spot that is natural, they're there. And kids are able to be there, and, they're learning to be careful of snakes and things like that, because we do have them here. We have rattlesnakes, but they're being taught that. And, yet at the same time, there's this symbiosis happening. It's so exciting. So to me, that just proves, one, they have this interest. The kids are there. They hang out after school. So that's just one thing that wildlife will come, your kids will learn, but they're not putting chemicals there. And that's the thing that I love about this whole part of it is your kids are going to be in a safe habitat where a Facebook group of birders, the one lady went in, she went to a big box store and showed a photo of flowers, and it has something Nicotiana or something on there.
Nicotiana is a flower.
Nicotiana.
It says something about the EPA lets this happen, and it's fine, or the FDA, I can't keep up with it, but she was like, this will hurt your hummingbirds. This will hurt your flower, your plant, your bird life and everything. Don't buy this. And I was thinking about the butterfly bush thing we talked about. So I was wondering too. So there's chemicals, but now don't we have to, if we look at wildlife, birds, butterflies, bees, all the pollinators, our kids and our pets, we have to look at the plants and that they don't need that kind of stuff. So the plants are coming with chemicals.
Yeah. I mean, there is, I know what you're saying. You were trying to say neonicotinoids.
I can't pronounce that.
Because there's a plant.
I don't do that.
No,
neonicotinoids are...
Yeah, there's Nicotiana. That's a beautiful plant. It is a tobacco plant.
Yeah.
Okay.
Neonicotinoids are a group of pesticides that are systemic. So they, the seeds are treated with them and plants are treated with them, and they basically are absorbed in all parts of the of the plant's parts. And so if something... like, for example, a bee comes and drinks the nectar, well, they are likely then going to be poisoned by that plant. And unfortunately, these groups of pesticides have come about because, believe it or not, they are a lot less toxic than some other things and persist less and things like that. And so they really grew in popularity. However, nature's all connected, right? And there's no undoing that. When you pull one thread out of the food web, it affects everything else. And so even though they are better than some other chemicals that we used to use, they still are having an impact. And we're learning, there's still a lot of science that needs to be done, but all the indicators are that they are definitely having impacts on pollinators and bigger ecosystems. And so the National Wildlife Federation actually just passed a resolution at our last annual meeting that we're pushing for the EPA to suspend use of and approval of all of these kinds of chemicals until we can get further research into the actual impacts that they're having on bees and other pollinators and things like that. So or are widely used, as I mentioned. So what you want to do to avoid them is look at the plant label. You may or may not see something, earmarking the plant saying this was a plant treated with neonicotinoids. Ask at your local nursery. Use your voice as a consumer to be an advocate for natural gardening, because if you don't tell the garden center where you shop that you want plants that don't have neonicotinoids, they're not going to know. And if you do it and I do it and all your neighbors do it, well, then they're going to know there's a market for plants that are not treated with this stuff. And a lot of nurseries nowadays are actually, making a statement and saying they're not going to carry plants that have these. So that's something definitely to look out for. But going back to your bigger point there about this little corner that, just has a little bit more vegetation than maybe the surrounding lawns and concrete, and what a magnet it is for wildlife. You guys, it's like, Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come. If you plant it, they will come. It's true. It works. It does work. Yeah, that's what this is all about.
So the first step,
but then I want to just say for a child growing up, they're being taught, but they're not being taught. They're assimilating knowledge through their own viewpoint. In other words, they're watching it and they're connecting the dots, as opposed to being told it's this, this, this. And when they reach the level where they're being told, they're like, oh yeah, I know that. Actually, I've seen it. So, and I think that's what's missing a lot of times, especially if you're going to talk politics and representatives, that maybe they never had the opportunity to actually assimilate their own knowledge and know what's true and what isn't.
Don't start me.
I think that's a valid
I know,
point.
but this is the thing. I think it is absolutely true. So now kids, let's just reel it back in here. Kids getting into a garden that is native. Okay, so the school I'm talking about, this tiny, I'm going to send you a photo. It is this small
It's so
corner.
cute.
It's like this is your corner, but most of the land and everything around other than the field is, we're pretty natural out here in Tucson, but and people have learned that. People's fences are prickly pears, because like people won't come through there, but I was going to say guinea fowl.
Bunnies do.
What do you call them? Quail
do.
But so it's interesting. But this was, I was thinking about this the other morning with you coming on the show, and I was like, these kids are learning their local plants. They're learning.
Exactly.
I see them with their little, sitting outside. The teacher comes out and talks about it. And I was like, this is so cool. These kids are going to learn the difference. And so, therefore, they're going to learn, don't plant those big box nicotinias, whatever. No, I don't want to say the wrong thing. Whatever you said. Thank you. The neonicotinoids. Whenever it's that big, like you already have to start worrying.
Race.
Yeah. So if there's you've got to, well, we need to do, I want to cover something on that because people need to know. And that's the thing. So if kids know that these are native plants, then they will feel safe. Right? So we need to create that as a sanctuary for them first, as a parent or a school.
Yeah.
And that's the first step.
Yeah, and again, you guys get it. That's what this is all about. Create natural garden spaces that support wildlife, that don't rely on a lot of chemicals, which, by the way, as you mentioned, are not particularly good for us or our pets either. I always cringe every time I see, the people who have the chemical-treated lawns with the sign where there's a big X over the kid and the dog. How crazy is that we're poisoning the very land that we live on? But
and
that does exist. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we're going to plant some native plants. Take your kid to the nursery, the native plant nursery, right? Are they part of it? What are the first steps to creating a little sanctuary for your kids to get involved? What are the first steps we can do?
So I think one of the easiest things to do to get your kid engaged as far as creating a garden, and specifically a wildlife garden, is to plant sunflowers. Oh. Sunflowers are super easy to germinate. You can get the little planting pots that will basically break down in the ground, so you can start your seed right in there, and you don't have to pull it out. You can plant that right in the ground. You can even use like little paper Dixie cup type things as well. And you just get a little bit of potting soil. Go to your local garden center. In fact, a lot of grocery stores, hardware stores, and home improvement stores all have seeds out around this time of year. They're going to be putting them out pretty soon here as spring comes upon us. You can get sunflower seeds anywhere. And sunflower seeds are great wildlife plants. They have nectar and pollen for bees and butterflies and other pollinators, even the heavily cultivated varieties. There are native sunflowers out there. Most of the seed packets you're going to get are cultivated varieties, but that's fine. They're not considered an invasive non-native plant anywhere. So they have great nectar for bees and butterflies. And then once those bees and butterflies come and pollinate those flowers, they basically fertilize them, and they are able to produce the delicious sunflower seeds. And, of course, birds love the sunflower seeds. So you really get multiple seasons of habitat value out of that sunflower plant. But, again, it will germinate super quickly. Kids have short attention spans, so you need a little bit of instant gratification here. And within a few weeks, the plant will be ready to plant outside, and a few weeks after that, it'll start blooming. And then the kids can really see the direct connection between getting their little fingers in the dirt and planting that seed and have ownership over it. And then they get to go out and pick where they're going to plant it in the yard. And, obviously parents have to help with this, making sure that it stays watered and, engage the kids in it. Let them name it, and it becomes a whole season-long activity. And it's so easy to do, and, kids love it. So that, I think, is like a super simple step that you can do to begin to get your kids engaged in the garden. Another one. Yeah, another one
because we have them out here. Sunflowers go wild, and I know that we even back in the day bought all these native plant seeds. Like we have them. I'm just saying here in Tucson. I was always thinking like sunflowers, are they really native? Except for the native ones that we see in the parks. And then you wonder about those too, because nowadays I'm always wondering, is this an invasive? Is this mustard or not? You get to this point of wanting to learn, but it's so cool because the bugs love them. I have so many sunflower photos with bugs that I don't know, and I'm trying to identify the bugs, and they're super cool, crazy bugs. And as a kid and as an adult, I'm like, that's so cool. And you get to watch it, and especially if they're around. I didn't know that about you. Made my life just so happy to know that sunflowers are okay. Yeah, I'm really happy to know that.
And just to say that bugs are okay too.
Bugs rock.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's part of it for kids.
But the natural, most often response to bugs is get the spray, kill them.
No.
And oh my gosh, they're so interesting.
Yeah,
we have some beetles out here that are just really just watch them. They're so cool.
I know. We're weird, but we're not. We're not weird. I think we're just happy people because we're in nature. That's the cool thing. Okay, so what's your second thing? Because this is cool. I didn't know that about sunflowers. I remember growing beans in school.
I was just going to say, just before I got on the call, I was revising our pollinator tip sheet, and the number one bullet under the tips is if you have bugs in your garden, it's a good thing. Bugs are a sign of a healthy environment, right?
Yeah.
So the second thing I would say is get your kid outside and let them dig in the dirt.
Yeah.
We're so afraid of kids getting dirty. I think there's actually a greater awareness nowadays that over-sanitizing kids is actually a bad thing. It can actually, lead to a weaker immune system. I always say, a spoonful of dirt is medicine. And I'm not suggesting that your kid eats dirt, but you know what I mean. Like when kids go out and get dirty, they get exposed to things, and their immune system builds up, so they don't end up with as bad of allergies or things like that. And so, let your kid go out and explore and do things like turn over rocks and tip over a fallen log, or look underneath the leaves of a plant in your garden and look for insects or insect eggs or caterpillars. There's so much life going on, especially if you have a native plant garden. Native plants support infinitely more insects and other wildlife than your ornamental exotics, which frankly were chosen by the garden industry because nothing eats them and nothing can live on them. So they're essentially the equivalent of putting out, sort of plastic plants in your yard when it comes to supporting wildlife and being part of the ecosystem. So, just something that's simple, and it could be in your own yard. It could be going for a walk around your neighborhood. A little bit more involved version of that is to create a nature scavenger hunt for your kids. So give them a list of things to go look for. A red leaf, a blue rock, a feather. Things like that they can actually actively kind of engage their mind and be thinking about and observing. And you can make it fun. You can give a prize or whatever. You could do this every weekend, and then at the end you have sort of this list, this little nature journal that your kids have created. So there's ways to do it real low key, and there's ways to do it a little bit more involved, depending on how much time and commitment you want to make to it. But again, even just getting your kid outside to get their hands in the dirt and look for worms and start to kind of learn about the animals that are actually living in your yard is a really great first step. And then you could take it to the next step and say, okay, well, we saw these earthworms. Well, what do you think they need to survive? We saw that bumblebee. What could we do to make sure that bumblebee, that she has a great home? We saw a bird. We saw a bird singing. What could we do to attract that bird to our yard so that it can lay eggs and have its own babies, right? Well, then that leads to getting your kids involved, but actually helping you put out and pick the things that you're going to put to create the habitat, which, as we've talked about in the past, is made up of 4 things: food, water, cover, and places to raise young. So, food mostly is going to be your plants. So take your kids to the garden center. Let them pick out the plants that they like that, obviously you can help them pick the good native plants, but, let them have a choice in it so that they have ownership over it. Let your kids, pick out the bird feeder that you might want to put out. Let your kids decorate the bird bath. Don't paint the inside, but you can get your craft paint out and paint the outside and make something pretty. Help your kids, or have your kids help you make a totem boat. Get an old clay pot and crack it in half. And again, you can paint that as well on the outside and decorate it and glue stuff to it and, make it look like a toad. And then put that out in your yard as a little space of cover for toads and other small animals. There's so many different ways that you can engage your kids in this idea of setting up a wildlife garden. And again, the more you engage them in the process, the more invested they're going to be, and the more meaningful it will be when they actually see, when you plant a milkweed plant and then you find a monarch butterfly caterpillar on it. I mean, whoa, that is huge. Then you get to watch the life cycle. It's one thing to watch this stuff on TV or read it in a book, but when you get to see it with your own eyes, or you see, a robin family raise their babies in your backyard. I mean, it's incredible. You can't replicate that.
Thing. And by the time your child becomes a congressman, he will know how to vote, or she will know how to vote.
Yeah.
No, it's true. I just get this feeling sometimes that politically we're dealing with people who don't know anything about nature.
Yeah.
They don't understand the web of life. They don't understand toxin versus non-toxin because they never went outside as kids
and saw
or something.
Mm-hmm.
Where everything was delivered phony, like here's your exotic plants, and as you say, they may be pretty, but they're not delivering what you need, so they don't really get the web of life, which means we can deny climate change. We can deny things that are happening in nature because it's easier to say no than it is to say yes sometimes.
All I can tell you is that the younger generation, as soon as it gets knowledge, it acts on it, and it does really well, and especially when it hits home, and just saying, like, really the young, you got to, I don't want to hear anything negative about young people.
No, I'm tired of that.
That's enough of that stuff, because look at that. Look at them. Look at them right now. Anytime that they can take a stand, they are. They may have their phones and their whatever, video games or whatever, but the reality is they are more clued in, and they want to do things. They want things to be better for them growing up.
Absolutely.
So really, the more we can do, give them space in a garden. We all want that. At the end of the day, when it's time for us to be sent off, the last thing we want to do is be out in the garden in a wheelchair. That's what we want to do. We want to be in the garden. At the end of the day, everyone, before they pass on, they want to be outside in nature, no matter if they're in a wheelchair or on a bench. That's what they want. So that just tells you how close we are to nature. And for kids, it is our duty that they have a natural space, and that we create it for them and allow them to also create and co-create with nature and understand it. I just want to tell you, speaking of painting and doing things, David, we were talking about you on a show the other day.
Oh, really?
There is a couple. Yeah, actually,
we do gossip.
We do gossip about you on the show. We did our garden gossip show a few days ago, and a couple, David and Shelley Neff, they do what's called Weird Home Tours in Austin, Texas. They have this amazing book of all these homes, and what they do is that people that go on the tours, the money goes to help people get into housing to move forward in their life. It's combating the fact that affordable housing is no longer in a lot of places. Anyway, the very first lady in the book is a certified NWF garden habitat, just saying.
Yeah.
And,
there you go.
We talked about it on the show, and let me tell you, now her place is an Airbnb, talking about being they had this whole write-up about it, and her walls of her garden are all painted with whales and all kinds of cool, crazy stuff. And that tells me, isn't that it for kids to have that? Get out of the box, everybody. Like, let it be fun, because garden and nature, like, it allows you to be real. Sometimes things die and some things thrive, and you get to have that point. Before you go, though, I want to know what's up with this bee habitat that you have, because I know you have one. I want to know, because most people will never buy anything that has like a bee, that you're going to now like have a bee home. Like, that scares people. So I wanted to ask you before. So now, finally, I
well, maybe the next time I come on, I can tell you about this whole new campaign that we literally just launched this week called Be Sponsible.
Okay,
cool. I don't have time to get into the gory details of it now, but everybody out there, if you just Google Be Sponsible, you can find out ways that you can get involved in helping to save bees. And I'm not talking just about honeybees, which are really a domesticated species. They're really important for agriculture, but they're really not quite wildlife. For us at the National Wildlife Federation, we're focusing on the native bee species. There's over 4,000 of them in North America, and a lot of them are declining too, including species like the rusty-patched bumblebee, which actually just got listed as an endangered species. Used to be really common in people's backyards. So here's the thing about bees. Incredibly important animals for life on this planet. They, without the pollination services of bees, life on this planet would literally come to a grinding halt. Over 85% of our flowering plants are dependent on animals to pollinate them and fertilize them, and mostly it's bees that are doing that. There are other insects and hummingbirds and things like that, but bees by far are the most important pollinators. And without the bees pollinating the wild plants, then the wild plants would never set the fruit or the seeds or the nuts that then feed all the other animals up and down the food chain. So they're really, really important. They're awesome backyard wildlife. They're wildlife that you can help on the scale of your own backyard. And it just boils down to planting a bunch of pretty flowers and not spraying toxic chemicals everywhere. If everybody did that, we could really give a boost to our bee population, and that's what Be Sponsible is really all about for the National Wildlife Federation, trying to get that word out and inspire people, again, just to plant the wildlife-friendly garden like we've been talking about for 45 years, and, think about the impact that you're going to have on bees. You could also do things like put out a native bee nesting block. Most of our native bees do not form hives. Everybody thinks honeybees. Most native bees are solitary. So it's one female bee. She finds a tunnel. Most species nest actually in the ground, in little tunnels in the ground that they dig. And about 70% of our native bees do that. The other 30% nest in like old, beetle tunnels or termite tunnels in decaying wood, like a dead tree or a fallen log. So, number one, you can give them nesting places if you allow some of your yard just to be in sort of like bare, gravelly dirt instead of mulching everything or planting everything. And that might become a really great, important resource for some of our native ground nesting bees. Similarly, you can leave out a fallen log or other kind of fallen woody debris that will be natural nesting places for those kinds of bees that nest in those places. Now, you can mimic those just like you can mimic a cavity in a tree for a bird like a bluebird or a chickadee or something that nests in holes in trees by putting out a bird nesting box. You can put out a bee house that has a whole bunch of replaceable little tubes that kind of mimic what their natural tunnels that they would be laying their eggs in. And even though they're solitary, they're happy to nest in close proximity to each other. They just don't have a hive where they take care of each other and that kind of thing. And so what the female bee does is she goes out and she gathers nectar and pollen. She goes into the tunnel. She rolls that into a little ball. She lays an egg on it, and then she builds a little chamber wall. And she'll fill up the tunnel, her nesting tunnel, with a whole series of these little chambers, and then off she goes. The little baby bees hatch, the larvae feed on the bee. It's called a bee loaf, like a loaf of bread of the nectar and pollen. They feed on that, they pupate, and eventually, oftentimes the next year, they'll chew out and they'll start the cycle again. This is what can be happening right in your own yard. And one final note, yes, female bees can sting. But most bees they're just not likely to sting you, especially native bees. The solitary bees, because think of honeybees. They've got a whole hive filled with all of their babies and all of their honey. They want to protect that, right? But most of our native bees don't have that. So unless you really grab them and squeeze them, they're really not going to sting you. I've seen little kids actually holding some of various native bee species with no issue whatsoever. Not that I recommend handling any wildlife, but you get the point. So bees are important. You can help them in your yard. And again, if you folks want to go check out the Garden for Wildlife program, you guys have been great about giving the website, nwf.org/garden. And if you go to besponsible.org, .com, you can get involved in that specific campaign tied to our Garden for Wildlife program.
Love it. I love it. Thank you so much because I wanted to know what that bee box is all about. We've gone from the beak box to the bee box.
And it is true. Sometimes we went on a hike with a ranger in Pinnacles National Park, and we're like, look at that. And he goes, that's actually a bee. They have
they have 400 bee species.
Yeah, and it didn't look anything like what I would know.
Oh my God, yeah.
So
I mean, that's
cool.
the other thing. Everybody thinks bees are black and yellow. No.
Yeah.
Not all bees are black and yellow. In fact, many bees are metallic, green or black or blue or even red. Many bees are tiny, little itty-bitty things. You probably have tons of bees flying around in your yard right now and you didn't even know they were bees. I actually just wrote a blog. So if you go to blog@nwf.org, all about, it's basically 10 facts about bees. So if you want to learn more about these guys and see some really cool pictures, seek that out. You can, again, Google Bee Sponsible or go to blog.nwf.org and search on bees, and you'll find it. But it's 10 facts, and this is all the stuff that I include in that blog, plus a whole bunch of other really cool info. So definitely check that out.
Okay, well, we'll have to do a bee segment, okay? And
yes,
I'll get
let's definitely do that.
From Pinnacles National Park on there because
he's great.
He's a bee man. He's a moth man too. He travels the country looking at them. So thank you so much. I know we kept you longer than normal, David, but it's always so exciting. We get all geeky out and I don't know. It's like a big nature fix. It's very cool. And everybody again, nwf.org/garden. Go there, get involved. It is so cool and really, you'll see birds that you didn't even know existed in your backyard. Seriously, we have cardinals in Arizona. Who thought, right?
Who would know that?
They're here now, and we can hear them all day long. It's so cool because we have native habitats all around us. So check it out, nwf.org/garden. Thanks so much, David. You take care.
All right, you too. Bye.
Bye.